Hi, I'm Shawn Zelig Aster, and I'm here to discuss with you the Exodus from Egypt as a historical event. In this brief slideshow, I will not discuss any of the biblical narratives of the Exodus, with which I assume you're familiar. I assume you know that in the biblical book of Exodus, there's a story of the Israelites leaving Egypt and subsequent stories of their wandering through the desert and arrival in the land of Canaan. I'm going to exclude all the biblical discussion and look only at material that reaches us directly from the ancient world, Egyptian texts, and archaeological evidence. Let's begin. Here's a short bibliography which shows some of the scholarly discussion of this issue. Many scholars have addressed it, and you can read some of this material on your own. There's really two ways of framing this question. One can ask the question, does the Exodus narrative tell everything that transpired? And I'm going to leave that question aside. Instead, I'm going to address the second question on the slideshow. Are there elements of the story that are paralleled in ancient texts that were written by the Egyptians, who presumably knew nothing about the Hebrew Bible? And do these elements show that at least parts of the story were not even invented by the Hebrew Bible, but actually show historical reality? Let's begin by looking at some of the Egyptian texts. We'll look at two types of Egyptian texts. First, some administrative Egyptian texts that speak about a group of people called the Shasu. And second, a stele erected by an important Egyptian pharaoh whose name was Merneftach. At the end of this presentation, we'll look at the archaeological realities in the period that surround these texts. First of all, who are the Shasu? Now we're going into the 13th century before the Common Era, 2,300 years ago to 2,400 years ago. And in this period, we find in the Egyptian texts written by the different pharaohs who lived then, stories about a Semitic-speaking group who lived in the wilderness, who were shepherds and nomads, and who were seen as outcasts by the Egyptians. And these people were called the Shasu, right? And this slide you see here is a relief illustrated by Pharaoh Seti I, in which he describes how he defeated the Shasu in the area of the Sinai Desert from the fortress of Silo to Canaan. In other words, that is the area which is today the Sinai, we call the Sinai Desert. So he defeats these Shasu nomads, and we know about these Shasu nomads. And why are these Shasu nomads relevant to the discussion of the Exodus? Let's continue. If you look at this text, you'll find here a story, again, from the relevant period, again, the 13th century BCE. And it tells us, in line 4.13, that the Shasu tribes of Edom have just passed a certain fortress from Cheku, and Cheku is the border between Egypt and Sinai, into Pitom, in order to revive themselves and revive their flocks. So we know that there are Shasu tribes from Edom, that the Egyptians are controlling their movements, and these Shasu tribes have flocks. Again, why is that important? Let's keep that piece of information and continue to investigate. We find a very interesting list from the same period. Again, all this is from the 13th century BCE or very close to the 13th century. We find here a text by one of the pharaohs, which lists different groups of Shasu. And these Shasu include, as we saw earlier, the Shasu of Edom, but here we also see the Shasu named Seir. Now, why is that name of interest? Because throughout the Hebrew Bible, Edom and Seir are equated. So we have a very interesting equation in the Hebrew Bible, which is reflected, apparently, in Egyptian texts, where the Egyptians speak also both about a Shasu called Edom and about a Shasu group called Seir. Now, who is Edom? Who is Seir? These groups in the Hebrew Bible are portrayed as groups who lived in the southern part of the land of Canaan, whose eponymous ancestor was the brother of the Israelites. these groups show up in the Egyptian texts. Do the Israelites show up in the Egyptian texts? We'll get to them in a moment. But first look at this list of Shasu and look at the last name on the list. The last name on the list, if you're familiar at all with the Hebrew Bible, is the name of the God of the Israelites who appears throughout the Hebrew Bible. Right? The Shasu have a group, a subgroup called the Shasu of YHW. If you read this discussion by Daniel Fleming and many other scholarly discussions, you'll see that there is a general scholarly consensus that this name, Shasu YHW, reflects the idea that there is an Israelite element here, and that this is this Shasu group, our Shasu group is a group who worships the God that later becomes, or that at this time is already, the God of the Israelites. And so along with the Shasu of Seir, there's also a Shasu of YHW, and these are groups of nomads who speak Semitic languages who are running around in the Sinai Desert near Egypt, 13th century, oppressed by the Egyptians, and seen by them as a lower social group. Let's see what else we know about these people. The Egyptians also describe in administrative texts from this period the pursuit of escaped laborers from Egypt, some of whom are, in all appearance, Shasu workers. Let's look at this text, where if we look at line 19.6, the writer sends a message to his bosses, and this is someone in the pharaonic administration, 13th century BCE in Egypt, who says that he sent after 2 workers, and he reaches the fortress of Cheku, and they have already passed, and the groom has come from the desert. They have passed the wall of the tower of Seti or Neftach. Lord preserve him, beloved like Seth. And so these are workers who are sent from the fortress of Cheku, and Cheku is reflected in the Hebrew biblical name Sukkot. In any case, is located here at the border between Egypt and Sinai. And these workers are escaping into the desert. Now that's very interesting. Is this a narrative of the Exodus? No, by no means is it a narrative of the Exodus. But it is a narrative of Asiatic workers who escape from Egypt into the wilderness along the route that the Hebrew Bible describes the Israelites escaping into the wilderness. And these Asiatic workers are pursued by the Egyptians until the point of reaching the wilderness, which of course parallels the biblical story of the Egyptians pursuing the Israelites till they reach the Red Sea, which is the border of the wilderness, and then they let them go because they can't go any farther. This is a very, very interesting text. And if we put together the text that we've seen up to now, we know that it is undeniable that in the 13th century BCE, there are groups of Shasu nomads who speak Semitic languages, one of whom is known as the Edomites, and another of which is associated with YHW, the God of the Israelites, who escape, or try to escape at least, from Egypt into Sinai, and in some cases from Sinai into Egypt, and are opposed by the Egyptian administration who want to control their movements. So far, we can't deny. Can we connect these with the Israelites? We can, if we accept that the Shasu of YHW are Israelites. Is it necessary to make that connection? It's possible, it's logical, it's not absolutely necessary. Let's move on to another text where the Egyptians clearly speak about the Israelites. Where are the Israelites? Let's find them in our next text. This is the Neftach stele, dated to 1207 BCE, written by the pharaoh whose image you see here. Here's a grainy image of the Neftach stele, which is, of course, in Louvre. And if you look at just a short passage of this text, you see here that Pharaoh speaks about Israel is wasted. Its seed is not, right? Wasted, like the modern meaning of wasted, destroyed. The seed of Israel is not. And the text very clearly refers to Israel as a Semitic-speaking group of Asiatics who are in the region that we know as Canaan. Why were these people Semitic-speaking Asiatics? Because the Egyptian text includes a determinative which says Israel is a group of Semitic-speaking Asiatics. Asiatics is the Egyptian word for anyone who is not Egyptian. Semitic-speaking foreigners. Where are these people located? Well, if you look at the map here, you'll see that the text refers to a city called Yenoam, which is in the northern part of what's now Jordan, but also to several cities in what's now Israel, land, of course, that we know as Canaan in ancient times. Let's look at the full text, and then we'll see how these names show up. Right? The text starts off by speaking about how great the Pharaoh is and how he has pacified and conquered many countries. And we'll begin here. Canaan is plundered. Ashkelon is carried off. Gezer is captured. Yenoam is made into non-existence. Israel is wasted. Its seed is not. And Huru, which is another Egyptian name for Canaan, has become a widow because of Egypt. How all these lands have been conquered by the Egyptians. And let's take a look at the map again. Again, Canaan, Ashkelon, Gezer, and Yenoam are the territories mentioned. Cities, last three of which are cities. Israel is a ethnic group. Where are these people located? They are located somewhere in this area in 1207 BCE. How do I know? Because Mer-Neftach speaks about defeating them in this period. In other words, shortly after the Egyptian texts talk about many groups of Shasu who are trying to escape into the desert, a different Egyptian text talks about the Israelites being located in the land we call Canaan. Now, were they located closer to Gezer, the center of Canaan? Were they located closer to Yenoam, on the eastern shore of the Jordan, what's northern part of what's today the Kingdom of Jordan? Impossible for us to know. There's good reason to think that these Israelites are located in the northern part of what's now Israel. In a moment, I'll discuss this, but it is clear and undeniable that there are Israelites in this territory in 1207 BCE, whether on the eastern side of the Jordan, on the western side of the Jordan, farther to the south, farther to the north. They are somewhere in this area between Ashkelon and Yenoam, more accurately, between Gezer and Yenoam in 1207 BCE, fighting with the Egyptians. Let's move on for a moment to discuss the archaeological evidence. The archaeological evidence shows undeniably that in the time of Mer-Neftach, which is the end of the Late Bronze Age and the beginning of the Iron Age, there is a new settlement wave in the northern part of what we call Canaan. The image on the right shows the number of settlements before the time of Mer-Neftach, the end of the Late Bronze 13th century, the end of the 13th century. And the image on the left shows what emerges in the 12th century, right? From the end of the 13th into the 12th, that new settlement wave runs through the area, and dozens of new settlements are shown. This map just shows you the number of settlements. Doesn't show anything about those settlements. I'll talk about that in a moment. But this territory, let's go back to the previous maps. This territory that's shown on these two maps is the territory north of the city of Shechem or Nablus in the northern part of what was then Canaan. Let's look at this area where the letters N and A are on this map. That is the territory we just saw before. From the end of the 13th century into the 12th century, an explosion of settlements in this area corresponding chronologically to the period where Mer-Neftach says he's defeated Israel, a new group which has not appeared previously in this region. What are these settlements like? What characteristics do they have? Well, first of all, they're clearly not subservient to the Egyptians. Not only does Mer-Neftach say that he defeated them, but there's no archaeological evidence that they have any connection to the Egyptian kingdoms. Now, there are Egyptian rulers or rulers who are subservient to the Egyptians at places like Megiddo in this period. this new settlement wave is not connected to that group of Egyptian rulers. They are independent. They don't have local kings, and they are, on the contrary, working without any central administration. Independent farmers scattered in small settlements in the hills and in the valleys, distant from the Egyptians, and differentiating themselves from attempts of the Egyptians to control the land of Canaan. One of the most interesting sites where we see these new groups is the site of Izbet-Sarta in the central part of what's today Israel, north of Ben Gurion Airport and just west of the city of Rosh Ha'ain. And in a very interesting site, this very interesting site, which dates a little bit later, it dates in the 12th century, but it's characteristic of the kind of settlement we find in the late 13th century as well. We see here a single large building of the type called in archaeology a four-room house. It's a house which houses a very large family. For by our standards, it's not very large, but for them, it's quite large. It's about 10 meters by 6 meters. It contains a group of rooms all clustered around a central courtyard, and it contains a series of grain silos in which grain was deposited. And one of the most interesting things at this site is this very little piece of pottery on which was inscribed the Hebrew alphabet going from left to right, right? The Hebrew alphabet is usually written from right to left. Here it's written from left to right, in order, but written by someone who has a great deal of difficulty writing in an organized way. And in many cases, the writer flips the letters in a kind of mirror image, which is characteristic of very young, usually of very young people who are learning to write. This person writes the alphabet, the Hebrew alphabet, which is of course also used by the Canaanites, and tries to inscribe here exercise of learning the alphabet. This is the 12th century BCE, roughly 50 years after Merneptah declares that he has defeated the Israelites. Very interesting text, and this site has buildings characteristic of many of the other sites of the late 13th and 12th century in the region of northern Canaan. Here, of course, we're in the central part of the country, but it's a settlement wave which goes from the north all the way through the center. And what makes this site most interesting are not the buildings, which are characteristic of many other sites, but this inscription, which we find just here. Have we shown that the Israelites settled in Canaan in the 13th century? I think that's undeniable. We cannot deny what Merneptah says. There are Israelites in the center, in the country in the 13th century. Are the Israelites of Merneptah the same as the Shasu nomads whom we see in the earlier Egyptian texts? Possibly. Can we separate each of these groups and see the Shasu as separate, the Israel of Merneptah as separate, and the new settlements as separate? That seems not to fit with the evidence. We can't dissociate each piece here. We can't a priori postulate that the biblical account of the Israelites leaving Egypt and settling Canaan as ahistorical. What we seem to see here in the Egyptian texts are groups of nomads fighting with the Egyptians on the borders between Egypt and Sinai, moving into Sinai. One of these groups are the Shasu of YHW. And then a short time later, we find Pharaoh Merneptah saying, I have defeated the Israelites in the land of Canaan, indicating, of course, the Israelites are in the land of Canaan. There's archaeological evidence for new settlement at this time period. Let's get back to our original question. Can we show that elements of the Exodus narrative are paralleled in ancient texts written by the Egyptians? I think we've shown that. Does the Exodus narrative in the book of Exodus in the Hebrew Bible accurately tell everything that transpired during the Exodus? That's a question I'll leave up to you. Thanks for your attention, and I welcome any further communication. You're welcome to contact me by email. Thank you.